That's all.
Akhil, mind the gap. Good evening, everyone. This conversation runs the risk of turning into banter. So I used to live in Chennai. I don't now. For all the 5 years I lived in Chennai, I waited for Akhil to visit. Finally, when he booked the tickets, he dislocated his shoulder, so that never happened. So I'm really glad that he's finally come here. And most people know Akhil as a Delhi poet, a city poet, and in particular Delhi poet. And people are shocked that he's recently relocated to Bombay. I was speaking to somebody recently who knows Akhil also and didn't know Akhil's name. And when I informed him that he's gone to Bombay, I said, but how can that be? He's a Delhi poet. How can he go to Bombay, etc. So, and here we are sitting in Chennai, and in one of his poems, where he describes the shapes of various rivers, and he also talks about the Adyar River, and he says that the Adyar River, when it turns back and it takes a look at the city. So I thought, we are sitting in Chennai, Madras, and this would be a time to look back at places. You're a place poet, and places are very important to this book of poems as well, but I thought there was something different going on here, right? The book is called The Last Time I Saw You, and there's a way in which I and you have come into the foreground. The places are still there. So let's maybe begin by thinking about places, your relationship to places, your yearning to belong to places you've never been to, the imaginary of the geographies, where you grew up, what you did, a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself, but also how poetry got made in these poems.
Thank you. I'm very thankful to Ranveer and Harish and everyone in your team to have brought me here. My first trip to Chennai was also enabled by Prakriti, and I had a wonderful time, and this day has proven to be exactly similar. It's also a joy to have a conversation with Anannya, who's been a friend and even more a mentor for so many years. And in fact, we spent the day thinking about the book together. It's such a joy to see a close friend do a close reading of your poems. There's no greater privilege than that, because there's a way in which it's one thing for her to understand poems in a particular way, but it's one thing for her to give a sense to me of being understood. And so this day has been joyous, and maybe some of that we'll be able to share with you in this conversation. In thinking in terms of places, we were just talking about, I grew up in Lucknow, and part of it is crucial because all the languages in this book are also something which I heard constantly in Lucknow. My parents were second generation partition refugees, living in Lucknow, speaking in Punjabi with each other, speaking in Hindi with us, aspiring towards English, telling us, don't say botal, say bottle, don't say chawal, say rice. And I studied in this old fati-dati colonial school called Amartya College, where you used to be beaten with bait, your knuckles would be turned red if you speak any language other than English. And all this while this is happening in Lucknow, which both its practices, but even the wider its perception is about this, an aestheticized Urdu. And all this while when Punjabi, Urdu and English are interacting with each other, you had languages which were demeaningly called Dehati, the languages of the villages around us. So you had all these languages making claims on you, and because of the place, which years later after school I came to Delhi, from where I have spent 21 years, as Ananya right now connoted, teaching in the Badlands of Dadri and before that Delhi University. And I believe that's where university education sort of allowed you to reclaim all your own languages. There is a way in which the chaos of Delhi University, and I'm sure once in a while the news of what's happening in Delhi University leaks over here, and often those are not very pleasant news. But what you did find there is a maddening slew of diverse folks who are constantly around you, and none of whose worldview simply overlaps with you or simply matches yours. And that's a good training for anyone at any given at any given phase of their lives. And so that was Delhi for me. there is a way in which you also, I mean, the last time I saw you, if the book is about love or loss or yearning or longing, there is a way in which none of these abstractions work in a vacuum. They always, each of these things, love, loss, longing, they walk on ground. They're not hovering 6 inches above in the air. You meet certain people in certain places, certain parts of the city, witness your experiences. There's a way in which every part of your memory is stitched to where it happened, and you can't divorce it from where it happened. So the place has always felt very crucial. And now I find myself, I'm 39, though I look much older, but I was just telling her that I find myself surrounded by creeks and bays and seas and all forms of water bodies in the city, which I have now moved to, Bombay, and it will be such a joy for the next 21 years to think what that will create. So I'm looking forward to that.
May I request you to read this poem? I often go to that pilgrimage spot in my city. It's on page 1.
The way that we are speaking about place is evident in this poem.
140. We thought there was going to be only one room between us.
There are neighborhoods you live in. There are places which are key to you because you might have grown up there, you might have gone to school over there. But as you evolve a relationship with a city, as you spend years in it, what happens is that you make a subjective map of the city. There are places which have certain experiences which only you know about. And everyone's, your and my subjective map of the same city will be very different from each other. There's this wonderful, there are many academics in the room I see as well. Michel de Soto's French philosopher, The Practice of Everyday Life. He said, he's standing on the top of the World Trade Center in New York. This is when the building was around. And he's looking down and he's looking at all these New Yorkers and they're all ants. And he says, well, the town planner will tell you to go from point A to point B in New York. This is the shortest and the most efficient route. But not everyone is taking that route. Someone is not taking that route because their favorite coffee shop happens to be elsewhere. Someone's not taking that route because they had a traumatic experience with their ex over there. So everyone's figuring out their city in their own tactical way. There's one of those tactical ways perhaps emerges in this poem. For those who have the book, 140. I often go to that pilgrimage spot in my city where you and I sat once and said those words. I won't repeat them here, but you know that evening. Often when a day slips out of my hand, I go sit there. It was cold today, that metro station granite. Around it, they have now planted champa trees. Their shade doubles up as a sanctorum. I sat there for an hour. People thought I was waiting for someone. People were right. Everyone on a pilgrimage is waiting for someone, for a small god to turn suddenly kind, to step out of his home and will a flower to drop into our laps. No one suspects this guy sitting against the stone is praying for the day to solve itself, is taking the snow-bitten air in his hand and turning it into a god, that even his empty hands are an offering. Look how the distance is turning everything we touched into a blessing. I take this empty space and give it an origin myth. In this story, each one of us, in the end, turns into branches, bursting into champa. And the thing is, each of us has that pilgrimage spot. Some of you must have let some perhaps intimate others into what that secret spot of yours might be, but some of you might not have been. And every time you pass that place or every time you find yourself pausing in that place, only you know how sublime that spot is. And this is one such example.
Thank you, that was beautiful, Akhil. I paused at these lines. I take this empty space and give it an origin myth. And what I've noticed as a pattern in your poetry, and I really had fun doing this, Mark Doty, you and I talked about this essay before, right? It's this absolutely gorgeous essay on Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Fish. The essay is called Tremendous Fish, where basically it's a poet reading another poet for craft, and he goes line by line, image by image, to unpack what that poem is. And as I was reading your work, that's how I felt. I think your work really lends itself to that kind of a reading. So this idea of the empty space and the origin myth, I noticed that you do this a lot actually, and it is really concerned with etymology, and you take etymological definitions of words and then you turn it into poetry, right? Completely prosaic lines into poetry, but you also make poems spin on single words and their etymology. Like, it happens over and over in several poems. In fact, your very first poem is called Etymology, but in others as well. So I was wondering if you want to think about, what it is. How does a poem spin on a single word, and whether that has to do something with lovers, and especially lovers who are mourning the loss of love, hanging on to every word. Is that what it is, if you want to think about that?
There is a way in which, anyone who writes, and I know that there are several people in the room who write, particularly poetry, there is a way in which you cannot be certain about, you cannot have confirmed notions about or secure about other people's and their emotional worlds, which can be chaotic, erratic, eccentric in the best of ways and in the worst of ways. But what you can be secure about are words, and the materiality of words and the inscribed nature of words, and the fact that we will find them again and again. Isn't it amazing that you like a Mir Taki Mir couplet, and 2 years from now you can still go back to that couplet, 20 years from now you can still go back to that couplet, and each time it will give you something else to take back with you. So there is a way in which I think language, no matter whatever entropy, whatever chaos exists around it, language was always a repository of consolation, was a repository of some form of certainty, and I found myself going back to it. There are also, when a person leaves, what they leave are traces in language. They might have given you a nickname. They might have said something. One particular afternoon, they might have surprised you in bed by saying, "Why can't you stop the rain for me?" I was like, "Wait, how can I stop the rain for you?" But that line sort of stays with you constantly. And I think people become sentences after they leave. So there is a way in which one holds on to those sentences. So perhaps that's why, perhaps I could give you an example by reading a poem or two.
As a unit of
Okay. Which page?
This is page 37. So page 37 for those who have followed. Maybe you can start with etymology and then move it. That's page 1 and then 47.
The book was also written in the year 2020, and for anyone who has 2021 way, which all of us remember, it was the year of COVID. It was the year of a gruesome wave of an illness which transformed the way we navigated our cities, which transformed the way we navigated our relationships, which gave us a completely transformed view of how we think of our own goals, priorities, in relationships in life. But in Delhi, particularly, it was also the year which saw one of the most, in recent decades, one of the most gruesome instances of communal violence in Northeast Delhi, particularly. After which, even people who otherwise were just protesting against a discriminatory law found themselves incarcerated, and several of them continue to remain so. Each of those are at the back of this poem. Etymology. Page number 1 is the first poem of the book. Etymology. Grief comes from gravel, burden, the weight you carry, the holding on to land beneath your feet, unmistakable like its skin, gravity. Sadness comes from the old, saeed, sated, weary, the sense of the last hour, the wilting of mountain grass, the unexpected density of stars, the realness, the restlessness of your head on the arms of enough. Pain comes from paina, punish, a shrinking of the sun, long corridors of wall and metal, and a slow unknowing of mercy, an unknowing of what to do with the sudden expansion of time, a traffic of remembering. You left, and the sentence does not end. As a unit of measurement, course. We must have all heard, those of us familiar with Hindi, Urdu, Hindustani, itne कोस दूर, अरे वो तो कोसों दूर की बात. So कोस, and I was like, wait, we don't use this in modern terminology. How do you measure a course? And that's where this point came to me. As a unit of measurement, course from Croatian, call, was the distance at which another human could be heard. I didn't know distance could be measured in decibels. Counting how far a call carries seems like measuring the world in units of longing. Koso dur. Each complete only when a voice fades. These days, you stand always on that side of the course, in a place where my voice loses even to air. And I believe one of the risks that you hope to avert as well in a book which is otherwise about loss and longing, which all of us have felt in one manner or another, with one intensity or another. Those poems can also very quickly become schmaltzy and mockish and self-indulgent and everything which I tell my students not to do, but risk myself doing. One of the ways in which I told myself is maybe I can come at it as a historian or as a evolutionary biologist. So I would go to Charles Darwin. We know Origin of Species, Natural Selection, but he wrote this third book, The Expression of Emotions in Animals and Man. And on that chapter, there's one chapter on low spirits, and I was at very high spirits when I found that chapter. And in that low spirits, he's conducting these, which are the quickest guinea pigs a scientist can recruit his own children. So he finds these children and he asks them to look directly at the sun. And he sees the muscles that contract in their face are the same muscles which contract when a person is grieving. And he called them grief muscles. And I said, wait a minute, all these 4 years I've been mourning the passage of this person. And all that I need to do is contract these grief muscles to imitate exactly what one has been feeling. So there's a way in which entirely demystified the nature of grief. And in course, for instance, which is a unit of measurement which was there in Delhi of Akbar's time, which was there prior to that, it's a Sanskrit term. It's the way you measure it, it's changing across history. And when you hear that it's a distance at which another human being can be heard, suddenly a sort of minefield opens up. So I think that's what words give you.
Do you want to read the poem? Page 12.
But the jig is already up. The poem is called Darwin. You can read it on your own at some point.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you. So grief muscles in this poem, the work with the idea of force and the others. And I feel like this conversation can now go two ways. I think let's think about languages. And one of the reasons to pick up and read these poems is what Akhil is able to do with language. And words we talked about, but also language. And when I say that, the treatment of language is really unexpected, right? So Akhil not only moves between languages he knows, he actually goes to languages he doesn't know. Languages he's attempting to learn successfully and unsuccessfully. The sound of words of languages he doesn't know and doesn't speak, but also written, how scripts look like and how he sort of inscribes them with meaning. Really a whole lot of fun stuff goes on. So there are two fun things that we can now think about. One is, you work as a translator, you've translated Ravi Kumar, but more than that, you're also constantly translating poetry back and forth, English, Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi, English. And so, there is that work of a translator, but what I see you doing is that you bring the translation not as an activity elsewhere. Now I'm poet and now I'm translator. You bring the work of translation into your poems. And how you think about all of this, how translation works for you as a poet. And again, this is not the conventional that, oh, I'm also a translator and translate from Hindi and Punjabi and that's a separate collection. How it becomes a part of the poems you're writing in English is a very, very exciting thing. And I was wondering if you would like to reflect on that. And there are just so many poems to pick from. So talk about it and I'll give you a few options to read from.
Great.
Yeah.
In fact, the great thing about living in this part of the world is that we are all multilingual. I don't reckon anyone in the room is less than trilingual in some capacity or the other, and I have serious respect for anyone who's over pentalingual, of which I find several people in my classrooms and people I admire often happen to be these polyglots. So the great thing is that there is a way in which multilinguality gets at the heart of how we live and how we experience the world. We never experience the world monolingually. This one neighborhood which I lived in Delhi for about 11 years called Jangpura Extension, for those of you familiar, you would have diplomats speaking in French who were walking by. There's expats who can't afford homes in fancier neighborhoods. You would have the rickshaw puller who was driving, he's speaking in various dialects, various languages of Bihar. The shopkeeper that he's unloading his maal to is speaking in Punjabi with him. Whereas people like me who are crisscrossing this place are affluent English speaking folks, but also speaking in Hindi, Urdu, melding into those languages. So if this is the neighborhood I'm walking in, if this is the neighborhood I'm trying to describe, there is no way you'll get a rich textured description of this place without attending to each of those languages. And like for instance in a Delhi classroom, which I've been teaching for about 13 years now, in a Delhi classroom I'd say, so how many of you know Hindi? And several of them will raise their hand. And I'll say, how many of you know Urdu? And almost all of them will, the hand will go down. And at that point I ask, okay, so would you say, and for those of you who follow the language will follow this, I say, or do you say, मेरे दिल में ये ख्याल आया है? Or do you say, मेरे हृदय में ये विचार आया है? And they always say that they say the former and not the latter, but they identify the former as particular language and the latter as another. So, and there is a way in which obviously this subcontinent has had a history of beginning to treat post-partition one language as if it's a language of a particular religious community and another as if it belongs far widely, which militates against the fact that my grandparents wrote letters to each other in Urdu, like the script, the Nastaliq script. I don't know, recently when the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh passed away, you would notice that he read all his speeches in Nastaliq. So, the language is always far more complex than the silos we want to give them post facto. So the idea was that if I want to understand the world and if I want to understand all these avenues which this other person special in one's life opened up, then one has to attend to all the languages that he brought. Not just the language of, more abstract languages of love, loss and longing, but the very concrete languages in which we spoke to each other. And one of the things that we nerdily obsessed over was this one line from one of my favorite writers, Krishna Sokti. When I was reading her novel Dilo Danish, it has quite a wonderful English translation called The Heart Has Its Reasons. The line was, "Itna barik na सूती है कि हमारी जान पर बना है." And it's an exquisite line which both invites violence but entirely consensually. And there's a drama in that line which I could not quite capture. So one attempted to capture it in various ways. The epigraph of the poem is from Krishna Sokti, "Itna barik na सूती है कि हमारी जान पर बना है." The poem is called 12 Variations on a Sokti line on page number 2. It's the second poem in the book. 12 Variations on a Sokti line. Do not thresh me so thin that I die. Do not thresh me so thin that I die. Do not cut me so sharp that I break. Do not braid me so fine that I sigh. Do not shear me so close that I ache. Do not press me so hard that I paper. Do not knit me so tight that I tear. Do not sear me so far that I vapor. Do not draw me so red that I scare. Do not crush me so muslin that I fly. Do not burn me so ash that I winter. Do not spin me so cunning that I cry. Do not shard me so hot that I splinter. And each of these variations were ways to approximate what the Sopti line opened up for us. And a small, this is when the book devolves into confessionalia, but it's not in the book, but one of the ways in which the person who animates several pages of this book, one of the ways we met each other was a joint admiration for Sopti and what this line meant for us. And it's an incredibly evocative, resonant, lustful line. And all the ways that we could find to translate is what the challenge became. It's also a line, it's also, as fellow English literature teachers, we're also very proud when we manage to do what we teach. So it's an anapestic trimeter for those who follow. So, and I was very glad to have managed several of those lines, if not all, in that meter. And that's what we were talking about this earlier in the day. There is a way in which often when the content, affective content, emotional content, threatens to run in different directions which you can't control, there is a way in which once you find some kind of formal regularity, some kind of form that becomes, as one of my favorite poets Shahid used to say, rather than a dustbin for your thoughts, it becomes a vessel, a container for your emotions. And I think this here, the form at least found became a container for what I was feeling, vis-a-vis the Sopti line, which one can read again and again and again.
Thank you for that. Akhil, this is actually, as you know, one of my favorite poems. But this poem will also indicate to you yet another way in which there's a pattern to the way Akhil's poetic style works, and that is one of the list. And while list poems are not new, list poems quite often are about listing the beloved's characteristics. For example, in Western poetry, in traditions of sonnets, you have that. And in the Indian tradition, it's attributes of gods, right? 108 names of whichever god, for example. So while it is not new, I've not quite known any other poet to use listing quite as much in this book of poems as you have. And I was wondering if you want to quickly read Anaphora and talk about, if you thought about what this technique does for you, maybe talk about that a little bit. And after that, I'll ask you just one more question, looking at the time so that we can have your audience speak with you. So Anaphora is on page 90. Akhil in so many ways is a poet's poet. It's really great fun to read his poems. And here there is, please tell them what an anaphora is.
So anaphora is a poetic device which some of you already know, is when you repeat something at the beginning of each invocation, each line. The opposite of that, in one way, is the epistrophe, when you end each line with a particular word or a phrase. The word or a phrase over here is the past, and which any of us told to retell our past at different points of life will tell a very different story. So we know it's this malleable, chaotic, interesting, unforgiving thing. In this poem, one of the ways in which the structure helps is it gives you the skeleton to hang the flesh of your emotions on. Like without that, you wouldn't know where to place the kind of thoughts that you're navigating. Anaphora. The past is mercury on the tongue. The past is rattlesnake. The past is cube root of a wish. The past is what you make while cloud spotting. The past is our wounds slow clotting. The past is Luke chapter 23 verse 34. The past is a closing door. The past is buried alive looking to avenge. The past has not won yet. The past is a night-long body count. The past is not done yet. Chapter 23, verse 34. Do find out later on. I know some people nodded and I knew exactly they know what it is. but do find out. So, and for instance, as we were just speaking about, another poet who I keenly admire, as I've already mentioned, Aga Shahid Ali. If you notice his Kashmiri American poet, which several of you follow, if you follow his oeuvre, in the 60s he's writing this joyous juvenilia. He's a young student in Delhi University in Hindu College. Then he begins teaching as a young teacher. But in the 70s, an event happens in the mid-70s where one of his guiding lights almost, who he was friendly with, Begum Akhtar, who he used to read poems to, attend all, was a Begum Akhtar groupie basically. He used to, Salim Kidwai and Aga Shahid Ali would go and attend all her concerts. She passed away in 1974, and that's the first moment in which what mode that he would then stay on for the rest of his poetic oeuvre entered his verse, elegiac, where this kind of very textured and very restrained melancholia which helped him understand the various events of his life. In the 70s it was Begum Akhtar, in the late 80s and 90s it was what was happening in his homeland Kashmir, and in the late 90s it was what he called in one sense the biggest loss, which was the death of a parent, his mother, Sufia, who passed away. Of an illness which he would then pass away only 4 years later, of the exact same illness. And what he did, you will notice, is precisely when the subject matter became the most difficult in his life, what was happening to his homeland and what was happening to his mother, is when he started writing the sestinas and the villanelles and the canzones. And there is a way in which the form was giving him the vehicle for something which he thought was utterly unwritable in a sense. And there's a lovely, one of his Kashmiri friends, he died in 2001. So she wrote this wonderful obituary in which he is visiting Srinagar. He visited Srinagar once every year after he went to US in the mid-70s, except 1 year when the militancy was at its peak in the early 90s. So he's in Srinagar. He comes out running in his house, in the garden, and he tells her, I've finished it. And she's like, what have you finished? And he's finished his canzone, Lennox Hill, which is a 65-line poem where every line ends with one of the 5 repeating words, which was about the passing of his mother. And he was joyous, whereas he was writing about this extremely mournful subject matter, and that could coexist because the form allows each of those, that entire emotional bandwidth of a life to coexist, where you can be joyous about having reached a moment where you even begin to, as some people know in the room, that moment where you first thought, now you have mourned the passing of a parent. And it's an ecstatic moment if you have reached a closure in that mourning, and he seems to have reached that closure with the canzone. So yeah, in that sense the form is it's remarkable to rely on.
That was really good to hear again. So while we are on form, there are 3 poems I really want you to read, and I'll try and sort of sum up the concerns of those to make the context for it, though I don't think I need to, but still. Speaking of form, you may have all noticed that, there's really very sharp and precise imagery in Akhil's poems. And quite often, not all of you because you're all here, but quite often people will say, oh, I'm not a poetry person, I don't understand poetry, I don't get poetry. And I often think about what is it about poetry that scares people, or people say I don't understand. And to be perfectly honest, I also come across and read poetry that I don't understand. And Akhil's poems, I don't feel, and not just because I know him, but really there's a kind of access in his poems. And earlier this morning we were talking about exactly this, that what makes poetry inaccessible. And so we were thinking about how images, right? So one set of stuff for poetry, the basic stuff for poetry I think is imagery, and the other is narrative. Now the cause for lack of access might be that you don't know what the images, where the images come from, what they refer to. And when that happens, the narrative part of poetry can help sort of understand that. And sometimes when poets don't do that, we are at a loss, we don't understand what's going on, right? So that's one set of things, that the very, very powerful narration of imagery that it's possible that your readers don't have, but you build access to. The other is the idea of abstraction. how do you move from one imagery to another? One bit might be about something, the next imagery is somewhere else completely. And that process of abstraction again is another place that the readers, you may lose your readers there. And that absolute control you have over that is, very, very, I admire that a lot. And I was hoping we could, as a closing, I promised we will keep this at 40 minutes, so it will be that by the time you read and respond to this. So basically, stepping out of grief, and that really sort of follows from what you said. But also, I am wearing an omen, and well, these two for sure, and then we can see how much time there is, and your audience might request you to read something.
Great, thank you.
I'm wearing an ominous page 123.
1, 2, 3. For those who are following it. One of the, in fact, the entry point to splicing image after image without necessarily giving narrative continuity, the longest consistently written form in South Asia does that, the ghazal does that. There are ghazals which narratively also follow, where one couplet will follow from couplet A will follow from couplet B, etc. Vice versa. But the ghazal, each sher, each couplet can actually be thematically completely independent from each other. One ghazal, one sher can be about Jesus Christ, another couplet can be about the corridor of your school, a third couplet can be about the fight between Satan and God. So there is a way in which the ghazal allows you thematic freedom and formal regularity. So this is not a ghazal, however it attempts a movement between couplets which is not necessarily narrative. I am wearing an omen cut like solitaire on a ring. I am reading thumbs left in by photocopiers. I am telling the city I will need cradling. I am asking ice caps not to melt too soon. I am memorizing my world like elephants. I am learning the roots of bereaved, to be robbed. I am building a shrine to the saint of long distance. I am being born again, a stray dog loyal to strangers. You were beautiful like ground pepper, like a long neck before slaughter. You'd ask, why can't you stop the rain for me? You who crossed all rivers, who singed even water. One of the fondest memories I have of the city in which I lived for 21 years is that the tomb of Abdul Rahim Khane-Khana was not too far. And he was a military commander, he was a translator, he was also a poet. Rahim Ke Dohe, which we have either heard in original or in translation one way or the other. Rahiman Dhaga Prem Ka Man Toro Chatkaye Toote Phe Phir Na Jude Jude Gaant Pari Jaye, which describes a lot of our relationships, one way or the other, that once broken there's always a knot that will mark the bond, the thread between you and the other person. But Rahim is someone who I constantly read, considering he was my neighbor. The poem is called I Step Out of Grief.
Which page? 145?
145. 145. And I step out of grief, I believe the invocation is both polemic and hope, fact and fantasy. I step out of grief. I step out of grief into a Szymborska poem, into a night of gentle ribbing, into the remaining whisper of a promise, into Rahim talking of cucumbers. I step out of grief into perfect forgetfulness, into the etymology of desideratum, desire, into a floating terrace into the monsoon of his arms, into a translation of Lume Balania, into an 11th century fort overgrown with colonies of lantana, into Rahim talking of needles. I step out of grief, into a dream of my first swimming teacher, into the bottom of Naomi Shihab Nair's shoes to find the poems that had been hiding in the eyes of skunks for centuries, into the obverse side of sandpaper, that carries its softness, into proofs of the softness of this igneous world, into Rahim talking of pearls. I step out of grief into this banana peel of a day, into the smile made in Khatoli, into the pathway of Siberian seagulls waylaid by the false promise of the Yamuna, into the name of my great-grandmother who came from Halwal, into the peonies left outside Winehouse's apartment, into the bet each of us makes with October, into Rahim talking of threads and knots. Rahiman Dhaga Premka. I step out of grief into the tenacity of the knots of quartzite, into the neck of this god, into the sudden etymology of seer on Ombed's page, one who sees. Into a single movement of Chaur Sahib, each of its strands made of worship, into Rahim insisting on animating every object in the world, turning out their mutinous lies, into this night, into the slow sapphire skies, into what Satnam once told Amandeep, pushing him from behind, just a little rain, you are not made of salt. Into the resilient red on the forehead of the sandhill crane, into not being made of salt, into the arms of falling rain.
Akhil is now yours. Please ask your questions. Just like that? Yeah, just like that.
With regards to your poetry, it's predominantly in a written format. I wanted to know, what do you think is the difference between the written format and the spoken format? How is it different for you? And what is your preferred form? And my second question is with regards to grief. I would like to know your idea about it, because the mainstream conception are the 5 stages of it. So I want to know your definition. And how you dealt with it during the pandemic.
You thought you would just get away with the proximity.
It's a lot, but yeah.
Your first question about, I mean, one of the things that I've always wondered about is what the difference between a page poem and a stage poem. And there is a way in which a few poems can straddle both. I remember I sort of came into my own, particularly because of this wonderful teacher we had in Hindu college ages ago at Delhi University called Lalita Subbu. And she took everyone, she was one of those teachers, we've all had one or seen one. Not everyone has had one. who took students under her wing, and she made musicians out of those who wanted to become musicians. She made dancers out of those who wanted to become dancers. She made poets out of those who wanted to become poets. And there is a way, she passed away a few years ago, and at her memorial, we all spoke about how we thought we had the most special relationship with her, and she was one of those who hoodwinked us into believing that that was the case. So apart from her, the other thing which one came into one's own was performing on stage in various kinds of public occasions in Delhi. There are some spaces in Delhi, it's changed from earlier, in P.V. Narasimha Rao's time, there was a way in which opposite the North Block and South Block, there was, near India Gate is where the space of protest was. Later on, in later UPA governments, it came to Jantar Mantar. Now, there is no space of protest. But there is a way in which that's where one came into one's soul. So there is a way also that in which you had to speak, where the numbers in front of you could be 500, could be 1,000. In a Pride March, sometimes the number was 3,000. And there the trick is always language. There is a way in which the English will circulate, will have a certain kind of mobility, but it wouldn't, and would be of a completely different parameter and scale if you were to read a poem in Hindi and Urdu. So largely my performative poems, I came into them through performance. But this is a very quiet book. Like this, I don't know, I've never found a register in which one can grieve loudly. Though I do think grieving loudly can be extremely therapeutic. There are a lot of mourning traditions in South Asia particularly, in which loud grieving is in fact almost part of the rite of passage, part of the ritual through which you reach the other side of mourning. but this wasn't, because this is done over years, so this wasn't that attempt. Here, on a good day, it's meditative, on a bad day, it's mellow, but that's the scale, that's the spectrum of the kind of grieving that this poem is attempting to do. So these are very much page poems, except perhaps that Sukti poem, which one can put to music, etc. I mean, there are several which I think the contract is between the reader and the page. And I think that intimacy is what hopefully the poems will work in. The definition of grief. Now you've thrown a googly at me. that's where one was. I do think one of the things that Ananya said, about the list poem, which, and again, the thing about good interlocutors, the thing who have also been friends for years, is that they are able to see something which you haven't seen. And perhaps what is happening in the list poem is precisely a refusal of definition. That there is a way in which you can approximate the same thing through a variety of perspectives, through multiplicity of avenues, through all these different ways in which you can get at this one particular thing. And the list poem doesn't hierarchize the last one as necessarily better than the first way you tried. So I think the forms are also attempting and a personal calibration which changes with time of grief, rather than arriving at a definition of grief which in no text that I have read, which is actively about grieving, one has been able to. I mean, one of the most beautiful texts which some of you must have read for sure is The Year of Magical Thinking, Joan Didion, in which she's having dinner perhaps with her partner, and he just collapses onto the floor. How do you even begin to deal with the abruptness of that moment? And the book begins on that day and ends exactly 365 days later. Where you haven't removed the shoes from the closet because you think he's going to come back. Right? So grieving is this, it threatens to be an erratic process. I don't think it can be disciplined into
chances are that one person's definition will
It's very
not work
subjective.
for
I just
everyone.
wanted to know Akhil Katyal.
Read the
For
book.
that,
Read the book.
I'll be
Buy the book. Read it. Akhila.
Speaking of that Sopti poem, did you do this consciously? Because your sum came on the third word each time. So, and you were doing it in threes, which is with the tribes. Treshmi, tarata. Is that how you were doing it?
so I was very consciously, because I had tried multiple translations of this particular Sukti line from Dilo Danish, and I didn't know what will make them hold together, because they were going in very different directions. They were also, I didn't want to create a poem in which one translation is a supra translation where others feel like secondary translations. So there, I think the rhythm of it helped me. If I give each of those lines the same rhythm, there is no possible hierarchy which will emerge from it, apart from the fact that that rhythm will anchor the poem, rather than the fact that one translation comes before and another comes after.
And then, sorry, but
In Muslim,
I'm just curious. Yeah, you
Yes.
paused right after Muslim,
Yes.
and you created that
Yeah.
stretched space.
Yeah.
It
Because
was very powerful.
One of the things that I learned from Shahid was the difference between regularity and boredom. And so he says, so be regular, except not every time within a particular schemata. So there is, like in his canzone, which is about his mother, Lennox Hill, I really recommend all of you at some point, if you haven't read that poem. It's a 65-line poem, and the 5 words which end all the 65 lines are either mother, dad, universe, Kashmir, or elephant. So the mother word comes at least 13 times in the entire poem, ending one line or the other, except once. It's not mother, but it's father. And I was like, wait, but this is wrong. And yet, it's apparent. It has the der sound. There is a way in which it's both a repetition, but it doesn't toe the line. So he told me, no, you need to know the rule to know when to break it. So I thought I could do that with Muslim. That is not
Why Muslim?
because such a beautiful soft word.
Yeah.
so I thought that word could hold the the interruption, the change.
And the verbing of nouns.
And that's happening.
I have a question. With all these languages, when you dream, when you write, how do they sort of flow in your mind space?
This reminds me of this. In our masters, one of the class, we had this quite a wonderful teacher, and he said, we were reading Boogibar Kyoto. And so he said there are, in Africa in the 70s, there were these entire debates on what language one should write in. Several African writers chose to write in their local tongue, several writers chose to write in English. So there the hierarchy was set up about which is your language. So one of the first things they said, which language do you dream in? Then someone said, no, there's a truer language than dreaming. Which language are you angry in? Which you burst out in? And then someone said, no, there's a truer language than anger. Which language do you orgasm in? And there seemed to be a receding line of what the true language is till you reach the bedroom, in a sense. But as I was, while explaining my neighborhood in Delhi, or while explaining what a classroom in a Delhi university during those years felt like, there is a way in which you're constantly crisscrossing those languages, and as she said, the translation is not this activity which you do elsewhere. Translation is an aesthetic in which you remain. So you're in that, the trance means not being that side or not being this side. It's in the passage between, and constantly sort of ping-ponging or seesawing in the passage is where I find the most plentiful description of both places, worlds, people. That's what remains in my head. So but that doesn't deny the fact that there are very concretely some languages which fulfill your aspirations, some languages which get you the job, some languages in which communities which have traditionally been withheld from those languages want to aspire to and get to, and some languages which can be easily very romanticized or aestheticized. I don't know if you know, there's this festival in Delhi, Jashn-e-Ekta.
Yes.
And the most Islamophobic people will also land up at Jashn-e-Ekta and celebrate Urdu poetry. And you're trying to square how can this both happen together, because they're actually very happy with fetishizing a certain romanticized view of Urdu. So they would think Urdu is the language of almond eyes and cypress waist and moth to a flame, etc. That view of the language seems to predominate, except Urdu is a very ordinary language. You can have a recipe of a tomato soup in Urdu. You can have Arnab Goswami ranting in Urdu. You can have a news sticker having text in Urdu. You can have a manual a DIY manual to put together an IKEA furniture chair in Urdu. And I think that ordinariness of language is denied when you are romanticizing or aestheticizing it only in one manner. So, which is why, so there are very concrete hierarchies of language, but you try to let them intermingle.
But outside of this book, you write poetry in Urdu, you write poetry in Punjabi, you write poetry in Hindi, and you write poetry in English with these words mixed. I haven't read them in the other languages, but how do you decide which is the right language when a poem comes to you?
Earlier, I noticed that the more performative or the more comedic or the more boisterous poems happen to come to me in Hindi, Urdu, Hindustani, and whereas the more meditative, serious poems with more gravitas came to us in English. But that might be a function of my training, in which the language of informal conversation was constantly Hindi, Urdu, Hindustani, whereas the language of learning, training, acquiring knowledge in the school, this Slovakia who used to color our knuckles red, was English. But my hope was, and certainly after the doctoral dissertation and that kind of work, my hope was that I may be able to allay some of that division of labor. I am not entirely allayed it. I still find my certain registers more capable of that feeling in some languages more than others. That's true. So one is not able to entirely outlive what your schools or your colleges sort of ingrained in you.
It's not a bad thing, it's actually quite fantastic. Not many people have that, not many poets are writing in different languages at the same time.
The city that I moved to has some glorious examples, like Arun Kolatkar, and I don't understand Marathi, I'm beginning to get it now. I know the words for where, when, how, what, etc. I'm learning it very slowly, but the book that really moves me is Jejuri, the mid-1970s collection about him going to a small temple town in that book at least only a day. And there's Anjali Nerlikar, who's a literary critic, and she wrote this essay about the bilingual work of Kolatkar, in which his Marathi Jejuri, which coexist, is written about in the same time, is not an exact translation of the English Jejuri, whereby 5 Marathi poems will be condensed into one English poem, one image from an English poem will be taken, and that would be split into 3 Marathi poems, and that plays my ideal. That's my goal. Like that level of malleability and confident traffic between languages. It's a hard task.
Just writing on that question, I felt very hopeful because a lot of times in literature we talk about what is lost in translation, but what I'm getting from you is what is gained in translation, because not all of us know all the languages well. But you know, some I get often my North Indian friends mock me when I say I know Hindi or even Urdu I put in my resume, because a lot of times my exposure to love was through Urdu and Bombay cinema, right? So the fact that I know some Urdu is something I'm very proud of. And they say, no, you don't know enough. But I know nobody knows enough of a language, right? So I was just...
And what is the threshold of complete knowledge of a language?
Yeah.
Instead, can we be serious about what we know and what we do not know and what we can make of that threshold?
Yeah.
So, for instance, one of the things that Ananya referred to, if you find time, like there are poems in this where I'm reading a Rilke love song in German, but that's a language I don't understand. But I just wanted to see what the sound does. And German is a harsh, umlaut-ridden language, whereas a language which I was attempting to learn at some point and went far enough, but not. But as an adult, when you learn a new language, you realize it's not like swimming or cycling. You do forget it once you stop practicing. Italian, like there is a way in which some of the Italian poems, when you read, it's almost like a palimpsest. Like some lines you were a passion to them, whereas some lines were opaque to you. But that's my reality. That's my engagement with that language. Other than the fact that the languages which one grows up in, which is Hindi, Urdu, English, and Punjabi, those one constantly tries to navigate with different degrees of expertise. But we should be allowed to do that. So don't listen to those North Indian friends. Don't listen to North Indians.
You spoke about poetry as
Loud,
consolation. You spoke of poetry as consolation, but I'm just as thrilled by poetry as trepidation of sorts, in some ways, at least for the poet himself.
Slow down.
Can't hear anything you say.
I'll get there. I think it's mostly, was there a poem that was harder for you to write or read? And is there a poem that was easier for you to write or came easier for you to write and or read?
I think the poem that is hard to write is not so much of what its subject matter might be, but where you're trying to figure out what the ethical playground is vis-a-vis the person that you're writing about. Where there are certain permissions that I have and there are certain permissions that I don't have. But for a writer, that's a wonderful constraint to have. And within those constraints, how do you work out? So, since I think the poems that were challenging is where I didn't want the biography to overwhelm the artifact of the poem. One of the things that Anannya told me earlier today was, there is a sense in which biography might propel a certain poem into being, but ultimately it has to stand on its own rather than us having to know what happened to the poet. And I think that, to figure out the breach, to figure out what the distance the poem needs to travel to become that artifact, was the point. And one of the roadblocks on the way was figuring out how much can one tell of the narrative. Where, not mine, which I was entirely free to do, but which also belongs to another person. And most of our narratives, the strange thing about them, none of our stories are entirely our own. They always involve other people, they implicate other people. And you don't want to wrong them, because these are poems they'll read, these are poems they'll make sense of, and you don't want someone else to read the poem and get a sense that I've been misunderstood, or I've been appropriated, or my part of the story has been wrong. And to figure that thin line is a difficult task. I think those are so I think it was an ethical challenge more than a formal or a linguistic or an emotional challenge. In fact, by the time it becomes a poem, it's quite joy. So you aren't grieving in the act of writing a poem. You're trying to make it the best possible poem possible. Which is why Shahid, he's mourning the loss of his mother, but he's running to his friend joyously saying, I finished this poem. And I think that joy, when you reach that moment, is That moment is so capacious, no? Like, it can hold so much of what you want to do.
So we are at time, but
One last poem, perhaps?
wait, that's where I was coming at. I'm actually
Or
going
two
to
last poems.
step out of this book, step out of the script, and ask Akhil to recite something that I absolutely love. And every time I meet him, he recites, and he's already done it once this
Because
evening.
I've done it once earlier in the
Yes,
evening.
so I'm going to have him recite, and he does this together in English as well as Punjabi. Amrita Pritam's Main Tenu Phir Milangi. So I'm requesting Akhil to read that.
Several of us have heard this poem in one way or the other. Sometimes you heard the poem not knowing you're hearing that poem because it's there so much on social media. It has had this new life in the last 4 years, but before that it had the life in Nirupama Dutt's exquisite English translation. Before that it had the life in Amrita Pritam's own pen. So this is an attempt, with my hat being tipped to Nirupama Dutt, who translated this before me. The poem is called Main Tenu Phir Milangi. I'll read it both in Punjabi and English. मैं तेनू फिर मिलांगी किथे किस तरह पता नहीं शायद तेरी तखय्युल दी चिनक बन के तेरे कैनवस ते उतरांगी या खौरे तेरे कैनवस ते उत्ते रहस्यमय लकीर बन के खामोश तेनू तकदी रवांगी I will meet you again. Where, how, I do not know. Maybe as a bit in your imagination, I will come to your canvas, or like a cryptic line you draw, silently keep gazing at you. या खौरे सूरज दी लू बन के तेरे रंगा विच घुलांगी ते रंगा दियां बावां विच बैठ के तेरे कैनवस नू बनांगी पता नहीं किस तरह किथे पर मैं तैनू जरूर मिलांगी or like the ray of the sun I will mix in your colors and sitting in their arms become that which you draw. I do not know how or where, but I will meet you again. या खौरे चश्मा बनी होवांगी ते जिवे झरनियां दा पानी उड़दा मैं पानी दियां बूंदां तेरे पिंडे ते मलांगी ते ठंडक जई बन के तेरे छाती दे नाल लगांगी मैं होर कुछ नहीं जानती पर इन्ना जानती हां कि वक्त जो भी करेगा ऐ जन्म मेरे नाल टुरेगा. Maybe I will be a spring and like water fly to the wind, those droplets of water I will rub on your body and like a coolness I will lie on your chest. I don't know much, but this I know. In time when I go, all I have done will go, and when this body goes, everything goes. But the threads of memories are like the atoms in the universe. I will cherry pick those atoms, weave those threads, and I will meet you again. And जिस्म मुकदा है ते सब कुछ मुक जांदा पर चेतिया दे धागे कायनाती कणां दे हुंदे ने ते उन्हां कणां नूं चुरांगी धागियां नूं बनांगी ते तैनूं मैं जरूर मिलांगी. अमृता प्रीतम.
Can I ask two questions? Do you have time for two questions? One is, you've talked about all your influences, basically. They are of subcontinental origin. No, I can't hear you. Oh, okay, in short, some of the English poets or writers who have touched you, inspired you, or you enjoyed reading when you were growing up in your formative years. That's
So-
one.
The English poets, different registers of yourself are sort of engaged by different poets. The comedic and the boisterous, Dorothy Parker, Wendy Cope, early Aga Shahid Ali, like 1970s verse of
He's
his.
Indian. I'm talking about the non-Indian.
Wendy Cope and Dorothy Parker, New York and British. Carol Ann Duffy, who was the poet laureate in Britain, both in terms of her ability to. Both in terms of her ability to engage with the past, write a very kind of confident, unapologetic queer verse. There's Ruth Bedell, which she mentioned, who wrote a biography of Beethoven in verse.
Yes.
And there is a way in which what I found exquisite about that book is that it did both emotional work, but it also did the archival work. She went all over Europe looking at the archives related to Beethoven and all the museums which traverse Beethoven's life. And there's a way in which the archival and the affective comes together in that book. The book is called Beethoven Variations. So, so those are poets sort of who you're really looking up to. Apart from one of the poets that she also mentioned lives in New Jersey, teaches at Rutgers, Mark Doty, who wrote so evocatively about, particularly the one that was particularly moving for me about 80s and 90s in America, particularly in Reagan's America and loss of 12 lives during the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So that, and to be able to speak both powerfully, politically, and without shortchanging any of the emotional payload of that moment. He lost his own partner during that time. I think that's something that I admire, being able to do that.
And
Mark
also,
Doty.
and also eats.
No, because strangely, I found a bit of, I would say, John Donne elements in the way you jump from one imagery to another. That esoteric, which is very relatable. So I was actually very curious to know which, as they say, native English speakers, although Indian English is a bona fide dialect of English, but people normally make this differentiation between subcontinental English writers and non-subcontinental English writers. My second question to you is, I don't know, this is my take, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, I would love to hear your view. I find a lot of vigor, energy in Indian language poetry sessions. You mentioned you've been to all these Delhi swaris, poetry swaris, and there's a lot of energy. But I don't find that in the English poetry scene. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Could you just give us?
No, for instance, you will find other kinds of poetic cultures which accrue around in English. So for instance, if you go to one thing which one of the other audience members mentioned, like if you go to spoken word poetry,
Yes.
that can be done both well and badly, but that engages the body in a completely different manner. It holds you. Every inch of your attention it holds when done well. There is also, for instance, if you think, and if you have a fairly capacious definition of poetry, hip hop cultures, both in US and so they would you're right. So they would constantly engage and be a very animated version. I think because English in South Asia so far has had a very particular kind of life that largely, though now increasingly that's changing and thank God for that. And like authors like Acharya would demonstrate what that move is, but largely it has been held by the social elite, and the social elite do not tamper with the status quo, and so there's a certain kind of assumed communicability which they think the poetry already has. So perhaps that's why the English has had a particular life in South Asia, but not for long and not in every circuit. Like for instance, when I'm with reading groups or small performative groups in an Ambedkar University or a Delhi University or a JNU in Delhi, there are many different kinds of performative cultures rather than, let's say, an evening like this where we are thinking about a book which is necessarily about grieving, which is anyway a slower, quieter subject matter. So it has multiple lives, but you're right, it doesn't overlap simply with the Urdu Mushaira or the Hindi Kavita part and different performative cultures of Tamil poetry.
And how beautifully regional language poetry turns into spoken word poetry the minute the poet is on stage and saying it. But when you read it, it kind of talks to you like the poem that you would read. But when the poet says it, I mean, I don't find that in the English, scene.
If you don't find it, you have to write it. You have to write it.
No, I mean, I'm talking about the energy, when people interact. It's very intellectual, kind of very refined, as you were saying. So, that energy, I think we need that in English.
But is that the sound of the language itself? Should we do this a bit more informally? We can just because people I think might be wanting to leave. So people who want to talk to just
Can I
Yeah.
request a poem?
why don't you? But if people are sort of wanting to leave,
Okay, maybe one last poem and then
Yes.
we can
Yes.
go.
Yes.
you be sisters or whatever.
Okay, why not?
Yes.
Nice.
Dogs.
Both.
Yeah. That I found. Let's see, okay.
And that is one don't say. The other one is
I saw that.
Okay, I'll end with this one. For those of you who are following, it's 87. I was attending, thankfully it was a virtual memorial, so we could attend it. Memorial for Eunice D'Souza when she passed away, and he's also left us now, but Akhil Katyal just spoke very evocatively about a long time friend, companion, mentor, interlocutor, fellow poet. And so this draws on a lot of what Gabe said during Eunice D'Souza's memorial, where several other poets, students of hers over decades, also came together. So, and I'm glad both of you suggested it because it's a gathering of people who appreciate poetry, and she's the grand dame of it all. Listening to an evening of Eunice D'Souza tributes. In her last years, Gabe says, Eunice learned first aid from a vet and would treat the wounds of the local strays. After a while, dogs she didn't know from all over Wakola would come find her on her street, turn around and show her their wounds. Once her compound regular brought a stranger to her door for urgent treatment. I imagine the poet. Those speaking of her call her the grande dame, formidable, even charring, surrounded by dogs and parrots at the end. Opening her apartment door to find those who need healing. I go to my bookshelf, start looking up and down the spines like the dogs of Wakola.
So beautiful.